My name is Deacon Nicholas Denysenko, and I am an ordained Orthodox deacon and have been for 15 years now. I am the Yoakum Professor and Chair at Valparaiso University in Indiana. The title of my book that we're talking about today is The Orthodox Church in Ukraine, A Century of Separation. And very briefly, the purpose of the book is an attempt to explain how things came to be and arrived at the point that they are today with the Orthodox churches in Ukraine. The dates that I cover in the book are primarily from 1917 to 2016, so some of the more recent events are not covered in the book because of the demands of publishing. Perhaps in a second edition, if the opportunity comes about, I could reflect upon that, or hopefully there's also going to be a Ukrainian translation of the book. This is something that's in development now, and maybe there will be an opportunity there to reflect on some of the more pressing matters that we're hearing about today. But this is really an attempt to clarify issues, to set the stage to show that all of the things that are happening today are the results of events and exchanges and polemics that really originated back at the time of the revolution, when Ukraine began the process of attempting to establish a sovereign republic, and at the same time the church attempted to establish itself as an autocephalous body in an attempt really to restore the ancient Kyivan Metropolia. This is the complicated process. I pretty much have it memorized because I've been explaining this for so long now, but so I'll state it as simply as possible. In Ukraine as we know it, let's start with the eve of the revolution in 1917. At that time, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the Kyiv Metropolia, as it is widely called, was really a part of the larger, all of the Orthodox churches that were under the umbrella of the Orthodox Church of the Russian Empire. So the Kyiv Metropolia was perhaps the highest ranking see of all of the different sees in the Russian Empire. But even before the Russian Orthodox Church reestablished the Patriarchate, Ukraine was essentially subsumed as part of the Russian Orthodox Church, with the exception of Orthodox Christians who were not in the territory of the Russian Empire, but were either in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or then after the revolution in Poland. And this is where the waters become a little bit muddy, because what we see, historically speaking, is that really beginning before 1917, when there was an awakening of national consciousness in Ukraine, there was also a simultaneous awakening of an attempt to reestablish the Kyivan Metropolia. And among the reasons for this was that there was a Russification of the church, not only in terms of language or in terms of national identity, but also in terms of customs and even liturgical books that clergy had used as part of the Kievan church up until those were forcibly replaced by synodal books. And that was a process that began in the 18th century, really, when the Kyivan Metropolia had just recently been switched jurisdictions from Constantinople to Russia. So in 1917 and 18, there was a very serious council in Moscow. And unfortunately, that council was interrupted several times because of the violence of the Bolshevik Revolution. Many Ukrainians attended that council, and we get a hint at what could have been for the church in Ukraine when we read some of the preparatory documents of that council. So, for example, they were supposed to deliberate quite seriously the possibility of replacing Slavonic church services with vernacular Ukrainian. And then, for example, in Russian-speaking areas, they would have used vernacular Russian. But that proposal was temporarily put down by Patriarch Tikhon because he wanted to appease the old believers in the Russian Empire. Now, at the same time, a number of pro-autocephaly Ukrainian churchmen, both clergy and laity, petitioned Patriarch Tikhon to have their own all-Ukrainian council to once and for all decide what was going to happen with the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And he blessed the council, even though the sitting Metropolitan of Kyiv at that time, Metropolitan Volodymyr Bohoyavlensky, was opposed to having this council. That council was also interrupted by the violence of the revolution and the different occupying or governing forces in Ukraine. It's quite bewildering when we read the history of just how tumultuous of a time that was for Ukraine. But what happened was there was a sense, and even people who are more sympathetic to a Muscovite position have acknowledged historically that the majority of those who attended the council in Kyiv in its sessions were for autocephaly. But what happened is that when they ultimately voted either for autocephaly or for autonomy, a number of the delegates who had been for autocephaly were forcibly removed from that council in Kyiv. And then the church voted for autonomy instead of autocephaly, and that was kind of the first domino to fall that established the possibility for a separation of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine from the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, for a while in that very early period, there was peaceful, maybe not so peaceful, but at least there was no schism yet. There was still communion between those who were in favor of the Ukrainian Church, but tension was caused when they received permission from the Soviet authorities to use Orthodox churches in Kyiv and in the Kyivan region to have services in Ukrainian without the blessing of the ruling bishop. Eventually, these tensions came to a head. By 1920, all of the Ukrainian clergy who were serving in Ukrainian had been suspended from clerical orders. And eventually, first in May 1921, and then again in October 1921, councils were held in Kyiv that called for the annulment of the 1918 council that voted for autonomy, saying it was completely null and void, and for the establishment of a truly Ukrainian church. And this is what's known as the first Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, or as Ukrainians know it, as the Pershii UAPC. And that was the first main domino to fall. The problem that this group encountered was that they did not have a bishop who was willing to advocate for them. It looked for a while that Archbishop Parfeni was going to be their advocate, but he was instructed by the Patriarchal Synod to mind his own business and to support the unity of all of the entire church that was part of the Moscow Patriarchate. So they consecrated their own episcopacy without having bishops participating. And from a theological perspective, this was considered very problematic, because the Council of Nicaea stipulates that you have to have 3 bishops present when another bishop is consecrated. Nevertheless, they went on their own path, and you had the first break. And I think what we see with that first Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 1921, it was very popular. It was a church of the intelligentsia. It was a church that was pro-modernization. They used Ukrainian language in all of their services. They worked for the restoration of native Ukrainian customs. And they also grew quite rapidly, despite the fact that they themselves were under surveillance by Soviet officials and were eventually forcibly liquidated. And they lacked the resources, as did all religious institutions in the Soviet Union, they also lacked the resources to properly educate their clergy. But that was the first domino to fall. And that was the first separation. And what's most important about this 1921 group is that the fact that they did not have the customary, or what we would call the canonical order of ordaining their own bishops, it created a stigma of illegitimacy that became permanently affixed to not only the first Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, but the whole idea of Ukrainian autocephaly kind of took on this notion of radicalism, of rebellion. And so what were originally really normal aspirations for autocephaly that were iterated by the first uapatsa, they wanted to restore the Kyivan Metropolia. And we should note that when they ordained their first metropolitan, it was a metropolitan and not a patriarch. So that is a clue that shows us that they were interested in restoring the Kyivan Metropolia before it was ever annexed to Moscow, except this time it would be fully independent. The story becomes a little bit more complicated because the majority of Orthodox Christians, who were made up a very large minority of Christians in Poland, were Ukrainians. And they were very influential in the Orthodox Church in Poland. And in 1924, the Patriarchate of Constantinople granted canonical autocephaly to the church in Poland, which had a majority of Ukrainians as part of their church body. And so what happens is, from the very beginning, you have these two things happening simultaneously. One, in Soviet Ukraine, a church that is very much aligned with the intellectuals, aligned with the people, and an advocate for modernization, but carries a stigma of illegitimacy, which in a certain sense pollutes the whole idea of Ukrainian autocephaly. And then on the other hand, outside of Ukraine, and eventually these Christians who are in Ukraine, these Orthodox who are part of the Orthodox Church in Poland, would return to the rest of Ukraine after Yalta and after World War II. These Ukrainians were also, for the most part, pro-autocephaly, but they wanted to follow a canonical order for establishing autocephaly, and they pursued this path through the Orthodox Church in Poland with Metropolitan Dionysi as their advocate. Now, what would have happened had things gone differently after World War II? I think it's very possible that that issue would have been resolved then and not now. But of course, we have no control. We can't go back into history and to change it. And what happened with this uapatsa that emerged in the course of World War II is that while they were following through canonical means, they also were associated with this notion of illegitimacy simply because they wanted autocephaly. And very sadly, Ukrainians came into conflict with Ukrainians in the same territory in 1942. So the pattern was established from the very beginning. First of all, the idea to be liberated from Muscovite control. That you see with both the 1921 uapatsa and also the Orthodox Ukrainians who were originally in the Church of Poland and were ultimately blessed to establish an Orthodox Church in Ukraine during World War II in 1942. Second, to restore the Kyivan Metropolia, right? That was the original intent. And then thirdly, the idea was to unify all of these Orthodox Ukrainians into one body. And what really happened was it was a task that was made impossible, first because of Soviet persecution of the church. Despite the polemic and the negative rhetoric that we've heard for a long time now from anti-Ukrainian figures, if you will. As early as 1922, there is evidence of the Patriarchal Synod in Ukraine trying to reconcile with the Uapotsa, and they even declared temporary autocephaly for their own church. I'm talking about the Patriarchal Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. But the Soviet persecution of the church rendered all of these attempts at reconciliation, at restoring canonical order, impossible. And then in the course of World War II, rapprochement between the Orthodox Ukrainians who had very little opportunity to sort out their differences was rendered impossible by Nazi persecution of Orthodox Ukrainians. And then after the Yalta Agreement, it was completely impossible because the Orthodox Church was following the directions from Stalin, and the freedom that they had to reopen a couple of seminaries and not endure such fierce persecution simply made it impossible for a notion of a Ukrainian sovereign church to emerge with its own voice at that time. That opportunity didn't really come about until Perestroika and Glasnost in 1988 to 1989, when the previously illegal Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church was legalized in the Soviet Union. And this is where you have the initial separation of bishops in Lviv from the Moscow Patriarchate, and ultimately their election of Metropolitan Mstislav as the head of the Uapotsa, and then the enthronement of Mstislav as the first patriarch. And that was a very important step for Ukrainian church identity, because what they were trying to show is that the Ukrainian church was actually the mother church of the Russian church by elevating the status of the church to patriarchate from a metropolia. But again, church politics got in the way with the breakup of the Soviet Union. You know, and this is a very difficult issue, what I'm about to mention here. This is eventually the migration of then Metropolitan Filaret Denysenko from the Moscow Patriarchate to the Uapotsa, with the creation of what is now known as the Kyivan Patriarchate or Kyivsky Patriarchate. When Filaret moved from Moscow to the Kyivan Patriarchate, prior to his move, he had the support of almost the entire episcopate of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine for autocephaly. But 3 bishops withdrew their support and protested vehemently against the movement for autocephaly, and the sitting synod of the Russian Orthodox Church refused to put the question of Ukrainian autocephaly on their agenda. So he migrated to the Uapotsa, which then split into the Uapotsa, a much smaller church than it was under Mstislav's leadership, and a larger Kyivsky Patriarchate, which also recognized Mstislav as its patriarch. But ultimately, after Mstislav died in 1993, elected Volodymyr Romaniuk as their patriarch, while everyone knew that Metropolitan Filaret was actually administering all of the affairs of that church. So I think that when Filaret moved from Moscow to Kyiv, that so much emotion, misunderstanding, and simply ill will went into that move. And I am not assigning blame to anyone here. I want to make that very clear, but I'm just trying to read the history of that very difficult time. The pro-Ukrainian party felt like the bishops who were under Filaret had betrayed him. The pro-Moscow Patriarchate party felt like those bishops had abandoned him. And I think that it's very important to establish that the very figure of Filaret and all of the events associated with his migration from Moscow to Kyiv really set the stage for what we see today. But that stage, that entire situation already had the history from 1917 up until today. It had retained what we would call in our North American nomenclature baggage. So unfortunately today you have the fairly small UAPC that did not join with Filaret in the Unification Council of 1992. You have the Kyivsky Patriarchate, which for sure has grown since its inception in 1992. And then, of course, you have the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, and which is the largest church. The most recent sociological studies coming from Ukraine say that the Moscow Patriarchate has the most clergy, monastics, seminaries, and parishes, but that the Kyivan Patriarchate has the most adherents. And, you know, it's really hard to say what the truth is, because it really depends on whom you ask. So I would depend on those sociological studies to be as objective as possible. The problem with the state of things as they are today is that within the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, there is some support for autocephaly. But some of those who would probably support autocephaly are suspicious, first, of the person of Patriarch Filaret. Whether that's justified or not, I do not render judgment, but it's a fact. They're simply suspicious and hesitant to join with someone who was anathematized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1997. Again, an action which is dubious. And then second is the whole problem of Ukrainian autocephaly. And that is this stigma that has become attached to it, this notion that the aspiration for autocephaly altogether is radical and is separatist, and some have even called it fascist, you know, accusing Ukrainian autocephalists of ethnophilitism. That was a heresy condemned by Constantinople in 1872 that claims that only one ethnic group can legitimately belong to a particular church body. Obviously, it's a violation of the gospel as well. But this is why this is such a complicated issue. The issues beginning from 1917 through 1942 remain issues that ultimately, even if a Tomos is granted in the coming days, those issues will still need to be resolved. It will be a long process of working through, and I think really of Ukrainians themselves coming to terms with their own history. You know, I think the primary difference between the churches in Ukraine, and I'm talking about the Orthodox churches, would be language. So the Kyivan Patriarchate and the UAPC, the Autocephalous Church, they use vernacular Ukrainian fairly exclusively. I'm sure there are some places, some regions where they have parishes that they use some Church Slavonic, but otherwise they remain very loyal to the original impetus, even before any of this happened, of ultimately moving from Church Slavonic to Ukrainian. And it's a technical term. It's simply called Ukrainization. It was something that was promoted by the Soviet government in Ukraine before Stalin reintroduced Russification. And before the Soviet government ever implemented it, it was part of the general pattern of one of the top priorities of those who wanted to reestablish the Kyiv Metropolia was ultimately to move from Slavonic to Ukrainian. That issue was contentious from the very beginning. Some people accused autocephalists of forcing the issue. Language is such a funny thing. When people have prayed in one language for a long time, even if they don't understand it, they are hesitant to change. This is a phenomenon that that touches everyone, not just Ukrainians. To this day, there are Roman Catholics who want to pray in Latin, even if they don't understand it. In Greece, the Metropolitan of Athens, the Archbishop of Athens, introduced reading in modern Greek, the Epistle and the Gospel, alongside the ancient Greek. And the people rejected this introduction of reading in modern Greek, even though the older Greek is less accessible to the people. So there has been resistance on one front to liturgical Ukrainization. And the experience for the person in the proverbial pew, if you will, would be that when they would go to church, they'd either hear the music or sing themselves or participate in such a way where they would either hear Slavonic or Ukrainian. So within the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, I think that under the tenure, under the leadership of the late Metropolitan Volodymyr Bohoyavlensky, there was an attempt to gradually reintroduce Ukrainization. There were attempts to translate the liturgy from Slavonic into Ukrainian. And in some parishes, especially in the region of Kyiv and certainly in Western Ukraine that are still under the Moscow Patriarchate, they use some Ukrainian. But like North America, Ukraine is a very large and diverse country. And there are some people who self-identify as Ukrainians, but they're either Russian-speaking or they simply want to pray in Church Slavonic. So that would be the primary difference in terms of liturgical style, liturgical Ukrainization. As for other differences, you know, I think that modernization itself has fallen away a little bit. It hasn't been reintroduced to the agenda of any of the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, with the exception that in some places, and I don't know if there's a pattern, I haven't studied this particular issue. I think it would be very worthwhile topic of study, that in some places people might receive communion more frequently. In some places, they might be reading the prayers, at least some of the prayers, out loud for people to hear. Certainly, you see the building of churches in Ukraine, but when churches are built, rare is the occasion where you might see, for example, an iconostasis that's a little bit lower, where people can see what's going on into the altar area. If there are such attempts at engaging people with more rigor and vigor, they're more grassroots. I met, the last time I was in Kyiv in 2016, I met some people who belonged to a parish where they had a very strong adult catechetical program. And they were small groups of people who were getting together to discuss contemporary issues of concern and put modernization on the table, but these were grassroots. They were not at the highest levels of the church. I do know that this is a topic of quite serious concern. And for example, a few days ago, there was a roundtable in Kyiv that consisted mostly, but not exclusively, of Ukrainians who are currently in the Moscow Patriarchate, but have publicly declared their support for the Tomos of Autocephaly to be granted. And their number one interest is to say, what's going to happen in the church after the Tomos? What kind of a church are we going to be? Because their declaration was, we want the Tomos, but it won't solve all of our problems. And if we're really going to be a relevant church of the 21st century, we need to have on the agenda items for discussion where we're engaging the people in the issues that they face in everyday life. So some people have said that they're progressives, but I think it's a rather encouraging sign, and how widespread it is, I honestly don't know. But it's still an encouraging sign that there are cohorts of intellectuals who are interested in expanding their horizons and transcending what have been jurisdictional differences in order to look ahead and to imagine and to begin to take concrete steps towards the creation of a church that would be a church of the people. And if that does happen, what you will see is the recovery, at least partially, of one of the original desiderata, one of the original things that was desired of the pioneer architects of Ukrainian autocephaly, and that would be soborno-pravnists, governance of the church by council, and more simply speaking, serious, dedicated involvement of the lay people in the life of the church. And I want to make it very clear, because this is kind of a hot button issue, that governance by conciliarity, it does not mean that the lay people run the church and the bishops are their employees. Actually, it was Metropolitan Ilarion Ohienko of blessed memory who said, that's not soborno-pravnists, that's miriono-pravnists. That's the lay people ruling over the church. He was very critical of this notion. This is simply the church doing everything together: worship, liturgy, engagement of society, and also negotiations with government officials. Now, today, I think the primary difference that you would see between the churches would be language. That would be the main difference. And as odd as it might seem, I think that in terms of, when we think of what is Ukrainization, it has been a hot button issue among Orthodox in Ukraine. So let's say, for example, that the Tomos will be granted and that there will be one canonical Orthodox Patriarchate in Ukraine that's centered in Kyiv. They will have to proceed very carefully and pastorally with Ukrainization, especially in places, if you have a parish, for example, where they've prayed in Slavonic. You can't just simply very quickly introduce Ukrainization without handling it very gently. It has to be done in such a way so as not to provoke people to say that, look, they issued this Tomos and now everything has gone wrong and everything that we predicted was going to happen is coming true. So this is a way of saying that there is diversity among Orthodox in Ukraine, and that diversity will have to be respected. And I suspect it will take at least one generation of believers to come to, for this process of reconciliation to really begin to take hold, and for there to be certain elements that unify the people into one church. It won't happen instantaneously. It's not realistic. That's a very good question. The specific period that I covered was modern, so 20th century and forward. I want to address both the issue you raised from Bishop Viktor's remarks at that symposium. I also heard his lecture, and also talk about my own research process. In the academies in Ukraine, there are competent experts in Ukrainian historiography. These historians are much better historians of the entire history of Ukraine than I am. And it would be people who are housed in these universities and these academies in Ukraine who would be able to speak better to the sources of the entirety of the history. And for example, at Harvard University, at the University of Alberta, and many places in North America, and certainly throughout the rest of the world, there are also historians who could speak to, who could respond, I think, more expertly to Bishop Viktor's comments about historiography. In a more general sense, what I think is the important point here is who is the author of a larger narrative. And the author of the larger narrative, the idea here is that Ukrainians have not had control of their own narrative, and they're only beginning to emerge as the authors of their own narrative in this present post-Soviet period. And I actually think that the historian at Harvard, Serhii Plokhy, covers this very well in his general book, The Gates of Europe, which talks about he returns to the city-states of Kievan Rus, and how we understand the narrative. Were these city-states one solidly unified conglomerate, or were there differences between, say, Kyiv and Vladimir Suzdal from the very beginning? And I think that he shows very clearly how these differences existed from the very beginning, and how you have different centers coalesce in an imperial power in Moscow, and how Kyiv kind of bounces around after the Mongolian occupation or the Mongolian destruction of Kyiv. It becomes subservient in one way or another to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then it's kind of stuck between East and West for much of its history until today. So to me, the big issue is who's the author of the narrative, and what kind of a critical lens do we use to read these sources? And I do a little bit of that in the book, because I think that part of the problem for the history of the Orthodox Church of Ukrainians is that they've never really told their story in their own words. Someone else has taken it upon themselves to tell this story. And this is why this is such a problem in the Orthodox Church today. So for example, if you're an Orthodox Ukrainian and you have a sense of your own history, and then you meet well-intended Serbs, Greeks, converts to Orthodoxy, or even clergy in other churches, and you begin to tell them the story of how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church came into being, or say you know a little bit about the traditions of the Kyivan Metropolia. Frank Sisson has written quite effectively on this topic as well. And you begin to explain this to them. The vast majority of seminary graduates would never have read any English language publication that gives you a sense of what was distinct about Kievan Orthodoxy, as opposed to, say, Muscovite Orthodoxy. To do so, they would have had to have read Serhii Plokhy, Bohdan Botsurakiv, in this day and age, me, and there's a really wonderful scholar in Ukraine named Natalia Shlichta who's writing about the history of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine after World War II. It's really very rich material. And then, of course, there are historians who are writing in Ukrainian. Irina Perlovska comes to mind. She was at that symposium as well. And her colleague, Tatiana Yeliseyeva, also writes beautifully on this topic with great expertise. And there, of course, is Oleg Turi at the Ukrainian Catholic University. And I'm barely scraping the surface here. So there are people who are doing this, but non-Ukrainian Orthodox either don't have access to this material, or they haven't encountered it, and it's because Ukrainians have not been the authors of their own narrative. And I think that that's changing now. For example, when I was at Loyola Marymount, I had a colleague from Canada who was a professor of Russian studies. And in our conversations, he shared with me, he said, you know, the Academy of Slavic Studies in Canada is dominated by experts in Ukraine. And I know that this change is happening in the American level as well. And it's not so much that the Russian narrative is being replaced by the Ukrainian narrative, but that we see better clarification. We're seeing things more clearly now because we have Ukrainians who are taking ownership of authoring their own narrative. And this is something that needs to be nourished and encouraged and done through the critical lens of the studies of the humanities. I personally think it's kind of like a machine that is going to run beautifully now, especially as Ukraine exits the post-Soviet period and really begins to take on its own life as the next generations take up the mantle. Now, in terms of my own research, the archives that I studied there was a very generous offer at the University of Alberta to spend several very long days in the archives of Timofey Minenko, who was a longtime priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Canada, and also Botsurakiv's archives. And I studied those as closely as I could to try to gather evidence for my book. So there's both good news and also the kind of news that comes to, or the kind of things that people encounter when they do this kind of research. On the one hand, I wish that I had had more inside information on things that were happening in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine in the 1920s. Certainly, Irina Perlovska is the premier historian who is covering this issue, so I relied somewhat on her publications to retell that story. But the archival material did not have much on that particular issue. It was very rich in terms of the rise of the Orthodox Church in Poland, the granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly, and there were really incredible files of correspondence from figures such as Metropolitan Ilarion Ohianko, and this is when he was still the Bishop of Holm, and the Archbishop of Holm prior to his arrival in Canada in Winnipeg. There are precious materials there for devoted historians from Metropolitan Oleksiy Hromadsky, who was the head of the Autonomous Church in Ukraine during the period of World War II. There is really precious correspondence from Archbishop and later Metropolitan Ivan Teodorovich, who was one of the most important bridge figures from the first Uapatsa all the way to his enthronement as Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the USA. But I wish there had been a little bit more material on the earlier period. And I also, so for example, there's a legend that at the consecration of Metropolitan Vasil Lipkivsky, that the church used the hands of Metropolitan Makary of the Kyivan Metropolia as part of the consecration ceremony. And I was looking for evidence that would either confirm or refute that, and I didn't find it. I only found in Perlovska's books a discussion of whether or not the relics might be used in some way as part of the larger proceedings. So this is what happens in archival material. You spend a lot of time looking through things, and you probably discard or lay aside more things that aren't useful to what you're hoping to find. I also had hoped to find more inside information, for example, correspondence on the transfer or the migration of Metropolitan Filaret to the Uapatsa that ended up in the creation of the Kyivan Patriarchate. And while there were photocopies of important documents of what had happened in Kyiv, there was no private correspondence. And I'll be honest with you, I did find some things that contained sensitive information that I decided not to include as part of my study, mostly because had I included it, it would not have really strengthened my own hypotheses one way or another, but it only would have provoked more negative discussion about particular figures. So it ended up being, kind of on the side, if you will. But ultimately, this happens in archival research. I've also been through the archives of Father Alexander Shmemin at St. Vladimir Seminary, and, I have to tell you that when I was there, one of his final lectures was about liturgical change. It was written in 1983 before he died, very soon before his death. And it's not the text of the whole lecture, it's only an outline. And I sat there looking at this outline thinking to myself, how I wish that he had handwritten the whole thing, but that simply was not how he lectured. He wrote an outline and then he lectured extemporaneously. So this is the kind of thing that you encounter. My understanding is that for scholars who are able to spend a devoted amount of time in Ukraine, that there's treasures of archival materials to be plumbed for the historian. And I hope that scholars who don't have a specific agenda in terms of favoring one person over another, or one figure over another, but who simply want to pursue the truth, that they will go to Ukraine because really we need to understand better what was happening in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine at the end of the Soviet period and at the beginning of the independence of Ukraine, because this period is very critical, and the current information that is more readily available to the scholar is filled with polemics. And what needs to be done is we need to get underneath that layer of polemics to try to parse out the truth. But, you know, I want to say that I'm satisfied. I'm grateful for what I've been able to find. Well, you know, there are a couple of things that I'd like to share, and they involve two figures. One is Metropolitan Oleksiy Hromadski. And for those who don't know, he's very important because he was Ukrainian from Volyn, and he was perhaps the most visible leader of the Orthodox Church that ended up being the autonomous Orthodox Church in Ukraine during World War II, that was at odds in some way with the autocephalists in Ukraine. And they were pretty much established and housed at the Kyiv Monastery. And there is a longer story as to why they opted to return to the Moscow Patriarchate, and I cover that in the book. But so what most people who have followed the course of Orthodox history in Ukraine know is that there was an attempt to unify the autonomous and the autocephalous churches in an informal meeting in October of 1942. And the bishops who attended that meeting agreed to unification. And in a certain sense, their meeting could become something of a blueprint with some revision for a potential unification of the Orthodox churches in Ukraine today. Because essentially they said that the things that are different for us, our differences, we are going to, these are going to be the top items on our agenda, but unification is more important than working out the differences. Now what happened was that when Metropolitan Oleksiy returned to the autonomous church after the meeting at Kyiv, he was under fire. And the quick kind of, you know, if you Google it, what kind of a narrative will you find? The result will be that the autocephalists say that he betrayed the meeting, and those who are supported the autonomous will say, well, he was under pressure from both the Nazi occupiers of Ukraine and the autocephalists to sign that document, but he was opposed to it in principle. The archives contain letters that he wrote to autocephalist bishops, to Metropolitan Dionysy in Warsaw. And what you see is a picture of a person who wants to do the right thing. His heart is in the right place, and he pours out his heart in these letters. And that was part of what I find, I don't know if I would call it surprising, but in a certain sense, very human, of people who are in a situation where they have to decide very quickly, how do I act? And here you have all of this evidence. And by the way, some of the material is handwritten. So if you can read handwriting very carefully, and it's not all in Ukrainian, of course, much of it is in Russian as well. So there's a variety, a diversity of materials already there. But I have the picture of a person who is pouring his heart out in trying to explain what went wrong, why he couldn't come to an agreement with his own bishops, what he hoped for the future of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And I think this is very important, because the prevailing narrative is that some kind of Ukrainian nationalist was responsible for his assassination. And in my book, I said that when I reviewed the evidence that was available, that it was inconclusive as to who assassinated him. These are accusations that one readily agrees to show the legitimacy of their position over the illegitimacy of another. We don't have enough evidence to draw a conclusion. One way or another, it was a very, very bad moment when he was assassinated, obviously for the loss of human life, but also because it didn't help the possibility of the unification of the people in the churches, and the archival material shows someone who's pouring his heart out, trying to do the right thing. And the second person who also comes across this way in the archival material is Metropolitan John Teodorovich, because boy was he under fire. I mean, he was ordained in 1921 as part of this church. It was considered to be illegitimate, and he bore a great responsibility for the salvation of the souls, both of the flock that he served in Canada and then in the United States. And in his correspondence, he both has to explain his position for why he agreed to take the actions he took in 1921. And then he has to explain why he's deciding to have his ordination corrected. And that happened in 1949. And the way that the impression that I came away is, you know, you can read newspaper clippings and kind of get a sense of a figure. And when I read Metropolitan John's correspondence, the letters that he was exchanging, he wrote very well in English, by the way. I get a sense of a man who was of great courage. And I don't know if I would say that was surprising, but I simply learned something about people that I didn't know. And I think that the big takeaway for me is that all of these decisions were made in times of great duress. You know, there wasn't a peaceful time where they had 2 years to work out a process. There was always some kind of external pressure. When are you going to make a decision? Everything rides on what you do. And here you have two men who pour their hearts out, who question themselves, and you know, ultimately, and I'm not saying that Metropolitan Alexei didn't make the right decision, but with Metropolitan John, I see such courage in really walking away from principles that he had agreed to in 1921 for the sake of the unity of the church, because what resulted was there were two Ukrainian Orthodox churches in the United States. And when he took that course of canonical correction, we actually have a method, a model, a pattern for the unification of Ukrainians into one church. So those are two examples that I'm happy to share. I wasn't bored, I'll tell you that. I wanted to stay in those archives all night long, but they had to close the library. So I think there needs to be a more thorough investigation of key figures. So, for example, there's a really very good scholar at the Ostrich Academy, Andrei, I think his name is Smirnov, and he recently spoke at South Boundbrook on the anniversary of Patriarch Mstislav's passing. And he published a very good book, very informative. He also did research at the Alberta Archives of Minenko on Mstislav, focusing on his career prior to World War II through the end of the war, before he migrated to Canada first and then the United States. But I think it needs to be specific attention to these kinds of primary documents and what we can learn from them. A great deal can be mined. We can learn a lot about the kinds of negotiations that were happening that we didn't know about. I also think, though, and this is something that I don't know if I'll have the opportunity to do it. We'll see. If God wills, I may pursue it. I think that we really need to get a sense of how people in the parishes, communities, understand themselves and their role as Orthodox in Ukraine today. And what I mean by that is, I think it would be worthwhile for scholars to go and spend a devoted amount of time in, say, for example, 3 different parish communities in Ukraine, to talk to them, to learn about their history, to respond to the question that you asked, a very important question: how did they pray? How did they view, so say, for example, you were in a Moscow Patriarchate parish, what did the people have to say about the people in the Kyivan Patriarchate? Will that change after the Tomos. You know, a good example for that would be communities that say they prayed only in Slavonic and then they started to pray in Ukrainian. What kind of changes were introduced on the basis of introducing Ukrainian and replacing the Slavonic? What kinds of new icons were painted? What can we learn from the canonization of new saints? So another very good example of that is, you know, Petro Mohila was canonized as a saint both in all of the Ukrainian churches, in the Uapatsa, in the Kepe, and in the Moscow Patriarchate. What does that mean for the identity? I think that would be among the most worthwhile projects. And I don't really, you know, I know of one scholar who's been doing this kind of work, but I think a lot more of that on the ground, popular religion type of work that we'll learn a lot more about how people themselves are responding to the situation in time, how they view themselves, and how they view others in their surrounding communities, if that kind of a project were to be pursued. And that is actually my interest. My next book coming out is a profile of Orthodox parishes in America and how regular everyday people like you and me understand the liturgy. It's coming out in November, pretty much at the same time as this book in Ukraine is coming out. The Ukrainian idea would be to spend a devoted amount of time to try to get to know people and to really get a sense of who they are and what has happened in their communities, and then to connect that in some way to the bigger picture. So this book is an attempt to tell the story of the big picture. The next project, if I am able to pursue it, would get to that nitty-gritty, that level of detail, the nuts and bolts. There is a great deal that we can learn from these kinds of projects. I hope that other scholars will also pursue these kinds of projects too. Well, you know, I have a chapter on the book that covers what I call the diaspora, but it focuses on Canada and the United States. Interestingly, I've had a couple of social media friends in Ukraine contact me independently to ask me about that particular chapter because they're curious about that chapter. And I know that there's been some good scholarly literature on the history of the church in Canada, and I refer to that literature. But what was important to me in covering that particular chapter was to show that when immigrants move from one place to another, everything comes with them. So it's not only a migration of people, but it's a migration of their communities, of the way that they worship, and of their politics. And when these communities settle, I think what we see in the diaspora, particularly in the United States and Canada, is a different kind of a response to what was happening first in the Soviet Union and then in the post-Soviet period. And that chapter, in my opinion, is very important for one reason. It has a direct connection to what we see happening today with the possibility of the Ecumenical Patriarch issuing a Tomos of Autocephaly to the church in Ukraine. There are a lot of people who are suspicious of the Ecumenical Patriarchate taking this action. And what people probably don't know is that the precedent was set first with Canada in 1990, and then with the Ukrainian Church in the United States in 1995 when they came into the Ecumenical Patriarchate. What some people won't know, especially with the United States example, the Moscow Patriarchate vehemently protested the Ecumenical Patriarchate's reception of these Orthodox Ukrainians outside of Ukraine into the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But what happened was that the other Orthodox, after a brief period of hesitation, there was no problem. They ultimately entered into communion with the Ukrainians, whereas prior to that time, there had been no communion. That precedent was set, but what that also illustrated was that the Ecumenical Patriarchate was ready to take action on behalf of Ukrainians, whatever their history had been up until that point. And I think that that was an important precedent that was set that's contributing in a significant way to what's happening in Ukraine today. But along with that is an adjustment on the part of the churches in Canada and the United States. They also had to adjust to introduction of English language into the liturgy, dealing with questions of modernity, responding to attrition and to the lack of candidates for ordination to the priesthood. And so I cover a little bit of that as well in the book. So the book is a little bit more broad, but I think that there's something for everyone in reading the book that I hope people will come away saying, you know what, I didn't know that. Now I have a much better understanding of who and what the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is, both in Ukraine and also in the United States and Canada. You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. Very enjoyable. Talk to you soon. До побачення.